In the next two videos in this module, I'll be covering different perspectives of personality psychology. First, in this video, I'll start with the historical forerunner of personality psychology, the psychodynamic perspective, developed by Sigmund Freud. Whenever I meet someone new, I always kind of dread the part when I have to explain that I'm a psychology instructor, and it's because I almost always get the same response. It's usually something along the lines of, "Oh, I bet you're psychoanalyzing me right now." I always kind of cringe at this for a couple reasons. First, what people usually mean by this statement is that they think I'm trying to figure them out or diagnose them in some kind of weird, creepy way, and I'm definitely not trying to do that, nor could I even if I wanted to. The fact that I'm a psychology professor doesn't give me any unique or special insight into people any more than anyone else, especially not after only having talked to them for a few moments. Second, even if I was in a professional clinical setting where I was actively trying to diagnose a patient, I probably wouldn't be using psychoanalysis to do so. There aren't many psychologists today who still consider psychoanalysis to be a valid clinical tool. However, the fact that almost everyone I meet outside of psychology has the same response when learning about my profession demonstrates the enduring reach of Sigmund Freud and his psychodynamic theory. Perhaps the most famous psychologist, Sigmund Freud was actually a neurologist working in Vienna in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Freud's work with his patients led him to speculate about the importance of childhood events and unconscious thoughts and desires. Freud had a lot of ideas about personality and psychopathology. Collectively, these ideas came to be known as the psychodynamic perspective, which we'll be exploring more in the remainder of this video. A first component of Freud's theory was his structural model of personality. Specifically, Freud thought that the mind was divided into three main components: the id, the ego, and the superego. Let's look more now at each one. You can think about the id and the superego like the proverbial angel and devil on the shoulder. According to Freud, the id was comprised of people's instinctual drives and desires. The id operates based on the pleasure principle. It's always seeking immediate gratification of desires without much regard for long-term consequences. Freud thought that the id was the first part of someone's personality to develop, and you can kind of see this pattern of behavior in young children who haven't yet learned how to control their wants and emotions. In contrast, Freud thought that the superego represented people's conscience, the proverbial angel on the shoulder. The superego operates based on the morality principle. It's always looking to do the moral or right thing in a given situation, even if that means giving up something you really want in the moment. Because the easy or desirable thing and the right thing are rarely the same thing, it's not hard to see how the id and superego are often in conflict. Sitting between the id and superego is the ego. If the id is the proverbial devil on the shoulder and the superego is the angel, then the ego is the person, him or herself, in the middle, who ultimately has to decide what to do. The ego operates based on the reality principle. The ego ultimately has to try and find a way to satisfy the demands of both the id and superego in a way that is also realistic and feasible. No easy task. For this reason, Freud compared the ego to a chariot driver trying to control two wily horses who often want to run in opposite directions. It's the ego's job to rein them both in and keep the chariot going on an even keel. Freud also thought that the id, ego, and superego operate at different levels of consciousness. Here, you can see Freud's famous iceberg model. In this graphic, anything above the waterline represents a person's conscious thought, whereas anything below the waterline would be unconscious. As you can see, the ego is mostly conscious, as it is shown above the waterline. This is helpful because more so than the other two mental structures, the ego is responsible for navigating the constraints of the person's reality. In contrast, Freud thought that a person's id was entirely unconscious. Freud thought that this was because many times a person's instinctual drives and desires are experienced as deeply inappropriate and anxiety-producing, and therefore he thought that people buried these urges deep beneath their conscious awareness. However, Freud thought that these unconscious desires could still sometimes unintentionally slip out, so to speak, and reveal themselves in a person's thoughts and behaviors. And this is actually where the term Freudian slip comes from. For example, imagine the potentially embarrassing situation where you accidentally call your current romantic partner by your ex's name. Freud would believe that this was no accident. Rather, he thought that such instances were evidence of your unconscious desires for your ex slipping out and manifesting in your speech. Freud also thought that clinicians could be trained to access the unconscious through various means. One prominent way that Freud thought the unconscious often revealed itself was through a person's dreams. Specifically, he believed that different objects in a dream had various symbolic meanings, and that by analyzing those meanings, the clinician could interpret the hidden meaning in a dream. For example, if a person dreamed about kings and queens, Freud might think the dream was actually revealing how the person felt about his or her parents. Consistent with much of the rest of his theory, Freud thought that most objects in dreams had some sort of sexual connotation. Another way that clinicians in the psychodynamic tradition often tried to understand a person's unconscious was through the use of different projective tests. In a projective test, the person is presented with an ambiguous stimulus like this inkblot from the famous Rorschach inkblot test, which was developed by Hermann Rorschach in the 1920s. The person is then asked to interpret the stimulus. Because the stimulus is intentionally ambiguous, that is, it could be reasonably interpreted in several different ways, it was believed that how the person interpreted the stimulus revealed something about their unconscious feelings and desires. For example, I kind of see a wolf in this picture. Does this mean I am projecting unconscious feelings of being a lone wolf onto this image? The obvious issue with projective tests is precisely this ambiguity and subjectivity. Does seeing a wolf in an inkblot really reveal anything meaningful about my personality? Most researchers today think not. On the whole, projective tests, like the inkblot test, have been shown to lack both reliability and validity. In other words, their results are often inconsistent and they don't predict meaningful objective outcomes. Although Freud proposed that the unconscious could sometimes subtly slip out, he thought that in general the ego worked hard to keep unwanted feelings, memories, and desires from reaching conscious awareness. Specifically, Freud hypothesized the existence of various defense mechanisms or mental strategies the ego uses to deal with threatening situations. Freud's daughter Anna later expanded on these ideas, adding additional defense mechanisms of her own. In total, Freud and his daughter proposed the existence of around a dozen or so defense mechanisms. I'll cover just two in this video. The most basic defense mechanism is simply that of denial. That is, a person simply decides that something is untrue. This might be seen, for example, in someone with an addiction who adamantly denies that they have a problem, saying, "I can stop anytime I want." The notion that the person might have an addiction is psychologically threatening, so the ego simply denies that it's true. Another example of denial might be if a couple breaks up and one person in the couple refuses to believe that it's over, continuing to act as if they're still together even when they're not. The next defense mechanism, repression, is similar, but specifically has to do with forgetting. For example, Freud thought that people could repress traumatic memories, such as being bitten by a dog perhaps when they were younger. Later, the person might have a fear of dogs without knowing why. To date, there's been no solid evidence that the idea of repressed memories are real. However, there have been claims of people recovering so-called repressed childhood memories later as an adult. So, what might explain this? Although we can't know for sure, remember from Module 5.3 that we can actually create vivid false memories. That is, we can be subtly coerced into remembering things that never actually happened. And in fact, many reportedly repressed memories are recovered in highly suggestive environments, such as during hypnosis. So, although we can't say for certain whether repressed memories are indeed false, any supposedly recovered memory should be heavily fact-checked with independent sources to verify its authenticity, especially if it involves accusing someone else of a crime. For a video that talks a little bit more about repressed memories and what modern research has found, you can check out the SciShow supplemental video on Canvas. A final component of Freud's theory is his psychosexual stages of development. Similar to Erikson's psychosocial theory, Freud thought that as children grew up, they progressed through various developmental stages, each with a particular challenge the child had to overcome. If you caught the subtle difference, though, in Freud and Erikson's names for their two theories, maybe you can tell what Freud chose to emphasize in his model. Freud believed that if children did not successfully progress through a particular developmental stage, they could become fixated in that stage, resulting in problems in adulthood. This is actually where the unfortunate term anal personality comes from. Freud believed that if children became fixated in what he termed the anal stage of development, which centered around potty training, they could become either overly sloppy or overly neat and tidy as an adult. I won't spend more time talking about the psychosexual stages in this video, as it has been pretty much completely debunked. So where does the psychodynamic perspective stand today? Freud was exceptionally famous and influential even in his own time, and as my story at the beginning of the video demonstrates, that influence continues even today. And it turns out that a couple of Freud's ideas were kind of right, at least in broad strokes. First, Freud thought that basically every issue in adulthood came down to a problem in childhood, and this was pretty radically different thinking for his time. While Freud's emphasis on childhood was probably somewhat overblown, we do know today that childhood experiences are important and can influence our adult personality, although they don't completely determine it. For example, remember from Module 8.1 about the importance of childhood attachment for influencing later adult relationships. However, the specifics of Freud's developmental ideas, in particular his psychosexual stages of development, have not been supported at all. So Freud's general idea of the importance of childhood experiences has been shown to be true, although not exactly in the way Freud thought. Second, Freud was also one of the first to theorize about the importance of the unconscious. Again, this general idea has turned out to be true, although again, not exactly in the way Freud initially thought. Today, most researchers don't think about the unconscious in the same way that Freud did, that is, as a kind of hidden black vault where we lock up all of our anxious fears and unacceptable desires. However, as we explored in Module 9.2, we do have non-conscious or implicit processes, such as implicit bias, that can influence our behavior in subtle ways without our fully realizing it. In all, Freud was not a big believer in the scientific method, and he didn't test his ideas empirically. In fact, many of his hypotheses are not even falsifiable. Remember this term from Module 2.1, so they can't be tested empirically. How would we even set up a scientific test to determine if we have an id, ego, or superego, for example? So, although some clinicians do still use certain psychoanalytic techniques in their practices today, most of Freud's ideas have been largely discarded by the vast majority of modern personality and clinical psychologists. In this video, I discuss Freud's psychoanalytic perspective of personality. For the exam, you should be able to define and distinguish between the id, ego, and superego, discuss the role of the unconscious in Freud's theory, and describe how he thought people could access the unconscious, that is, through analyzing dreams and projective tests, define defense mechanisms and distinguish between the two defense mechanisms that we covered in this video, denial and repression, and discuss which aspects of Freud's psychodynamic theory have been supported by scientists today and which have not.